Jack the Ripper. In the fog-shrouded streets of 1888 London, a killer emerged from the shadows of Whitechapel, carving his name into history as one of the most infamous murderers of all time. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror lasted only a few months, yet his gruesome acts shocked the Victorian world and left an indelible mark on crime history. Little is known about the man behind the alias, but his crimes unfolded against the backdrop of poverty, overcrowding, and social unrest in London's East End. Whitechapel was a labyrinth of alleyways, teeming with desperate lives and unsolved mysteries, making it an ideal hunting ground. Jack's victims, 5 women, all struggling to survive in the harsh conditions of the East End, were brutally mutilated, their murders displaying an unsettling pattern. Each crime scene revealed precision and a methodical approach that suggested medical knowledge. Yet, despite intense investigations and growing public fear, the killer's identity remained elusive. The police, hindered by rudimentary forensic tools and a lack of organized crime-solving techniques, faced immense challenges. Public outcry reached a fever pitch as newspapers sensationalized the crimes, coining the chilling moniker Jack the Ripper after a taunting letter allegedly sent by the killer. False leads and hysteria spread, creating chaos and mistrust between law enforcement and the community. Despite numerous suspects and theories, Jack the Ripper was never caught. His abrupt disappearance only deepened the mystery, sparking speculation about his fate. Some believed he died or was institutionalized. Others theorized he fled to another country. Over time, Jack the Ripper became a macabre legend, inspiring countless books, films, and even tours of Whitechapel. Yet his story is more than a tale of horror. It's a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities of an evolving justice system and the human fascination with the unknown. Today the case remains unsolved, a dark enigma woven into the fabric of history. Jack the Ripper's identity may forever elude us, but the legacy of his crimes continues to provoke thought and research into the darkest recesses of the human mind. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, one of history's most infamous serial killers, terrorized the United States during the 1970s. Operating in a time when society was unprepared for the notion of a serial killer, Bundy's calculated brutality shook a nation. His crimes coincided with an era of growing independence for women, and many of his victims were young, educated women pursuing opportunities that were unprecedented for their generation. Born in 1946, Bundy's early life was marked by a turbulent and deceitful upbringing. Raised to believe his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister, the psychological impact of this revelation would shape him deeply. Though intelligent and charming, Bundy displayed early signs of antisocial behavior, such as animal cruelty and a fascination with control. Behind his carefully crafted facade of charisma and ambition lurked a disturbed psyche driven by a desire to dominate. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy abducted and murdered at least 30 women across multiple states, though the true number of victims may never be known. His modus operandi involved feigning injury or disability to lure women into his car, where they would be overpowered. Bundy's methods were chillingly consistent. He targeted young women with similar physical features, often bludgeoning them before strangling them. Some victims were later found posed in grotesque manners, reflecting his need for control even in death. Bundy's crimes confounded law enforcement. Operating across state lines, he exploited gaps in communication between jurisdictions. Investigators were initially unaware they were pursuing the same man. The public, meanwhile, was gripped with fear, and his ability to blend into society only deepened the panic. Media coverage intensified the hysteria, labeling him a charming monster, which further obscured his true nature. Bundy was finally arrested in 1975, but his cunning didn't end there. Escaping custody twice, he evaded law enforcement for months, even committing additional murders during his flight. His eventual capture in Florida marked the beginning of a trial that would captivate the nation. Bundy chose to represent himself, using his legal training to cross-examine witnesses, manipulate the courtroom and maintain the illusion of control. Despite his efforts, he was convicted and sentenced to death in 1979. Ted Bundy was executed in 1989, but his legacy lingers. His crimes led to advancements in profiling serial killers and improvements in law enforcement communication. Bundy's case also highlighted the complexities of evil, how someone so seemingly ordinary could commit acts of extraordinary cruelty. Today, Ted Bundy remains a symbol of humanity's darkest potential, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that vigilance against such horrors is an enduring necessity. Jeffrey Dahmer, the monster of Milwaukee. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a darkness haunted the streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one that would go unnoticed for years, despite the mounting fear and tragedy. Jeffrey Dahmer, later dubbed the Monster of Milwaukee, would go on to commit horrific acts of violence that would stun the nation. Born in 1960, Dahmer's troubled early life seemed to predict the horrors to come. Raised in a broken home with an emotionally distant mother and a father preoccupied with his own work, Dahmer showed signs of violent tendencies from an early age, experimenting with animal dissection and harboring dark fantasies. His crimes began in 1978 when he lured his first victim into his home. Over the span of more than a decade, Dahmer would murder 17 young men and boys. His killings were marked by a chilling methodical nature, with each victim often drugged, strangled, and then dismembered. He kept trophies such as body parts and photographs, to relive the horrors. Dahmer's signature was a grotesque attempt to create zombies, manipulating his victims in an unimaginable way before ending their lives. The investigation into his killings was fraught with obstacles. Many of Dahmer's victims were marginalized, their disappearances overlooked by authorities until a breakthrough came in 1991, when one of his victims, desperately escaping, led police to Dahmer's apartment. Inside, they discovered gruesome evidence of his crimes. The investigation revealed the extent of his terror, but it also exposed the failures of the justice system that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. During his trial, Dahmer was convicted of 15 murders, though his motives remained elusive. His defense claimed that he suffered from a mental illness, but the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. Dahmer's legacy endures in the form of a chilling reminder of how even the most ordinary-looking individuals can harbor monstrous intentions. His case has sparked discussions on criminal psychology, the failure of law enforcement, and the darker corners of human nature. Yet even today, unanswered questions linger. Was Dahmer born this way, or was he shaped by years of neglect and trauma? His story, in all its horror, continues to be dissected and studied, a painful reflection of the worst aspects of humanity. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. Born in 1906 in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein's early life was marked by isolation and tragedy. Raised by a domineering, religiously fanatical mother, Gein's world was confined to a bleak farmhouse with no social interaction. His father, an alcoholic, passed away when he was young, leaving Ed to care for his mentally unstable mother. From an early age, Ed was subjected to severe emotional and physical abuse, and his mother's teachings instilled in him a deep-seated hatred for women. After her death in 1945, Gein's mental state began to unravel, leading to his twisted descent into the macabre. Gein's crimes spanned from the late 1940s into the 1950s, though the full extent of his actions remained unknown for years. He is believed to have murdered at least 2 women, but it was his horrifying habit of grave robbing that truly shocked the world. Gein exhumed the bodies of recently buried women, using their skin and organs to craft grotesque trophies, masks, furniture, and even a woman's suits he wore to impersonate his late mother. His actions were motivated by a deep, unsettling desire to create a maternal figure and perhaps fulfill his twisted fantasies of reanimating his deceased mother. The first victim to fall under Gein's gruesome hands was Bernice Wardens, a local hardware store owner, whose body was discovered decapitated and mutilated in Gein's home. As investigators searched the house, they uncovered the full extent of Gein's depravity, human remains used in everyday objects, including a lampshade made of skin and a collection of skulls. The investigation into Gein's killings was a long and painstaking one, complicated by the lack of forensic tools of the time and the bizarre nature of the crimes. His capture came after word of his involvement in Warden's disappearance spread. When authorities searched his home, they were confronted by a grotesque scene, filled with human body parts and memorabilia that defied understanding. The shockwaves reverberated through the community, with the media quickly latching onto the macabre details of his crimes. Headlines painted him as a demented figure, but the true psychological profile of Gein was more complex. Gein's trial in 1957 brought his shocking behavior into the public eye. He was deemed insane and sent to a mental institution, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Despite his confinement, Gein's name lived on, forever tied to the horrific acts he committed. His case would later serve as inspiration for numerous horror films, including Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs, cementing his place in the annals of criminal history. The legacy of Ed Gein remains a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity. His case challenged our understanding of the mind, revealing a complex interplay of trauma, isolation, and madness. Though some may never understand the true extent of his twisted motivations, Gaines' crimes have left an indelible mark on both criminology and popular culture, reshaping the portrayal of serial killers in the public eye. The unanswered question, though, remains: could anyone have known the terror lurking behind the quiet walls of Plainfield? Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, one of the most infamous female serial killers in history, committed a series of brutal murders in the early 1990s. Born in 1956, Eileen's life was marred by trauma and abuse from a young age. Raised in foster homes, she was sexually assaulted and rejected by her family. These early experiences shaped her worldview and the violent tendencies she would later display. Her troubled youth was punctuated by a string of arrests and relationships with older men, many of whom were abusive. In 1989, Aileen began targeting men who picked her up while she was working as a prostitute. She claimed that each of the men attempted to assault her, leading her to kill them in self-defense. Over a span of 12 months, she shot and killed 7 men. Her victims were all middle-aged or older, and their bodies were discarded along Florida highways. Wuornos's modus operandi was consistent. She would rob her victims before shooting them at close range, often in their vehicles. The public reaction to Wuornos's crimes was mixed. Some sympathized with her, believing her claims of self-defense, while others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer. The media sensationalized her story, often focusing on her troubled past and the gruesome details of the murders. The investigation into her crimes was complicated by her shifting story and the lack of physical evidence linking her to all the murders at first. But as the evidence mounted, Aileen was arrested in 1991 after being linked to the killings. During her trial, Wuornos's history of abuse and mental health struggles were central to the defense, but she was ultimately convicted of 6 of the 7 murders. The public was divided on her case, with some calling for her to be spared due to her traumatic past, while others demanded justice for the victims. In 2002, after a decade on death row, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her case left a profound impact on society, sparking debates about the intersection of mental illness, abuse, and criminal behavior. Wuornos became a subject of pop culture, inspiring documentaries, movies, and articles. Her tragic story prompted discussions on the treatment of abused individuals and the complexities of criminal justice. While Wuornos's life ended with her execution, questions still linger about her true motivations. Was she truly acting in self-defense, or was she a calculated murderer? Her story remains a chilling reminder of the dark paths that trauma and a broken system can lead some individuals down. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. John Wayne Gacy's reign of terror in the 1970s forever altered the landscape of American criminal history. Operating between 1972 and 1978 in the suburbs of Chicago, Gacy's dark deeds took place against the backdrop of a society still reeling from the turbulent social changes of the 1960s. As a middle-class community sought normalcy, few could imagine the horror lurking beneath Gacy's well-groomed exterior. Born in 1942, Gacy's early life was marked by abuse, neglect, and strained relationships with his father. His youth was punctuated by signs of violent tendencies, including brushes with the law and an ongoing struggle with his own identity. Yet, to the public eye, Gacy appeared as the charming, community-oriented businessman, even donning the guise of a clown at local events, a stark contrast to the monstrous actions he would later commit. Over 6 years, Gacy lured young men and boys into his home under false pretenses, promising them work or a place to stay. Once inside, he would overpower them, subject them to brutal torture, and then strangle them to death, often with a tourniquet. His house, a grisly crime scene, hid the remains of 29 victims beneath its floorboards or discarded in nearby rivers. His method of victim selection, typically young, vulnerable men, revealed a disturbing pattern, but it wasn't until the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978 that authorities were able to make a break in the case. Gacy's capture was a result of a relentless investigation and the testimony of a young man who narrowly escaped his clutches. With physical evidence and witness statements, the police were able to uncover the depths of Gacy's depravity. His trial, which captivated the nation, was an emotionally charged spectacle. Gacy's defense claimed insanity, but the jury saw through his facade, convicting him of 33 murders. Despite appeals, Gacy was executed by lethal injection in 1994. In the wake of his capture, Gacy's crimes left an indelible mark on American society. They raised questions about the ability of law enforcement to detect serial killers, the role of the media in sensationalizing such cases, and the horrors that can hide behind the masks of seemingly normal individuals. His story sparked a greater awareness of the importance of criminal profiling and the need for better systems to track missing persons. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy continues to haunt popular culture, his crimes serving as the basis for numerous documentaries, films, and books. But beyond the chilling portrayal of a man who lived among us, his case also sheds light on the deeper psychological and sociological questions surrounding criminal behavior, questions that still challenge investigators and psychologists to this day. As we reflect on Gacy's actions, we are reminded that evil doesn't always wear the face we expect, and some mysteries, even with the truth revealed, never quite leave our minds. The Zodiac Killer. In the late 1960s, the quiet suburbs and winding roads of Northern California became the backdrop for a series of unspeakable crimes that would haunt the nation for decades. Between 1968 and 1969, a mysterious killer left behind a trail of fear, confusion, and cryptic messages, capturing the attention of the entire country. But even after more than 50 years, the Zodiac Killer's identity remains unknown, leaving a chilling sense of unfinished business. The killer's early life remains largely a mystery, with no clear answers about what drove him to commit such horrific acts. His first known victims, teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were shot to death on a quiet country road in 1968. The brutality escalated, and over the following year, more victims were claimed. His method was terrifyingly calculated. He stalked couples parked in remote locations, attacking them with ruthless efficiency. But it wasn't just the killings that made the Zodiac infamous. He taunted the media and police with cryptic letters, ciphers, and a chilling demand for recognition, claiming responsibility for the murders. The killer's pattern became clear. Each crime scene revealed a distinct signature. His choice of victims, young couples; his choice of location, isolated areas; his use of firearms and knives. And, of course, the chilling ciphers he sent to newspapers, challenging them to decode his identity. The public became captivated by the mystery, but the investigation faced significant obstacles. Limited forensic tools, misdirected leads, and public pressure only complicated the hunt. As law enforcement scrambled to find clues, the Zodiac's messages grew increasingly boastful, intensifying fear in the community. Though numerous suspects emerged over the years, none were conclusively linked to the murders. The trial never came, and as the years passed, the Zodiac's identity slipped further into darkness. Some believed he died, others speculate he moved to a new location, but the truth remains out of reach. The case inspired countless books, documentaries, and films, leaving an indelible mark on pop culture. But even more than that, the Zodiac Killer's case reshaped how law enforcement approached serial crime. It underscored the importance of public involvement, the role of media, and the need for advanced forensic technology, tools we rely on today. In the end, the legacy of the Zodiac Killer is one of haunting mystery and unanswered questions. How many victims did he really claim? Did he ever stop, or did he simply vanish? The chilling truth remains locked away, and perhaps it always will. H. Holmes. H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861, is often remembered as America's first modern serial killer. Operating in the late 19th century during the height of the Industrial Revolution, Holmes became infamous for his cunning manipulations and chilling crimes. His story unfolded during a time when cities like Chicago were rapidly expanding, creating a society teeming with opportunities, yet plagued with a sense of unease and growing lawlessness. Holmes' early life revealed a troubling past, marked by bullying and a complex relationship with his family. His psyche showed signs of darker tendencies, and some psychologists suggest that his actions were rooted in early trauma. Holmes' charm and intelligence allowed him to manipulate those around him, but beneath his polished exterior, he harbored a malevolent desire for control and death. Between 1890 and 1893, Holmes used his skills to lure victims into his specially designed murder castle in Chicago. A building constructed for evil, it was filled with trapdoors, hidden rooms, and gas chambers. There, he preyed on unsuspecting women, many of them lured by promises of employment or marriage. His methods were methodical and cold, with victims vanishing without a trace, their fates sealed behind the walls of his sinister structure. The first public clue came when the disappearance of one woman raised suspicions. However, it was only after an insurance fraud scheme and the discovery of his horrifying castle that the full scale of his crimes became clear. Investigators faced numerous hurdles. Holmes had carefully erased any evidence linking him to his victims, and many of the leads were false or led to dead ends. The media sensationalized his crimes, adding to the public's fear and fascination. Eventually, Holmes was caught through the unraveling of his financial schemes, and the trial that followed shocked the nation. Convicted of murder, he was sentenced to death. Holmes was executed in 1896, but even after his death, his true body count remains a mystery. Estimates vary, but the horrors he committed have left a lasting legacy on the American public consciousness. The legacy of Holmes' crimes sparked widespread reforms in criminal investigations, pushing for better forensic methods and greater scrutiny of those in positions of trust. His life has been immortalized in books, documentaries, and films, with some still debating whether his full story has been told. What makes Holmes' case so chilling is the psychological complexity of his mind, a man who seemed ordinary to the world yet harbored a monstrous desire for destruction. The H. Holmes case serves as a stark reminder that evil can often hide behind the most charming of facades. It poses critical questions about the nature of violence, the depths of human depravity, and the lengths to which some will go to deceive, manipulate, and ultimately kill. Yet, the full scale of his actions and motivations remains shrouded in uncertainty, as much of his story remains a mystery to this day. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. In the 1980s, Los Angeles and the surrounding areas were gripped by fear. The name Richard Ramirez became synonymous with terror, as his reign of violence left a trail of death and destruction. Operating between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez terrorized the city with a series of brutal killings that would haunt the public's psyche for decades. His crimes spanned both urban and suburban neighborhoods, leaving investigators baffled and a frightened community on edge. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. Growing up in a broken home, he was exposed to violence at an early age. His father, a brutal authoritarian, and the exposure to his cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who showed him disturbing images of war atrocities, left a lasting imprint on Ramirez. These early influences fueled his later criminal actions, and by the time he was a teenager, his life was already marked by brushes with the law, including petty theft and drug use. But what really marked Ramirez as different was his cold, calculated nature, hiding behind a seemingly charming and approachable exterior. Over the course of a little more than a year, Ramirez committed a series of home invasions, rapes, and murders. His victims were often chosen at random, ranging in age, race, and gender, which only made the police's task more difficult. The brutality of his crimes, from shooting to stabbing to bludgeoning, was unlike anything seen before. He would often leave symbols like pentagrams on his victims' walls, further heightening the fear that he was operating with an occult motivation. His ability to evade capture, despite a growing police effort, was part of what made him so terrifying. Public panic escalated as news spread. The media frenzy painted him as a ghost, a faceless figure moving in and out of homes without warning. His crimes stoked a fear of random violence in people's everyday lives. Authorities struggled with a lack of forensic evidence and false leads. But as the city grew more fearful, Ramirez made a mistake. His face was caught on surveillance cameras, and a witness who recognized him led to his arrest. At trial, Richard Ramirez's demeanor was chilling. He showed little remorse and, at times, openly glorified Satanism, using it as part of his defense. The courtroom became a spectacle as he smirked and waved at supporters, a haunting image of a man seemingly proud of the chaos he had wrought. Convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 rapes, and 14 burglaries, Ramirez was sentenced to death. Despite the conviction, Ramirez's legacy continues to raise questions. Was he simply a product of his environment, or was he a true psychopath, driven by darker, internal forces? His story has since been analyzed in numerous documentaries, books, and films, adding layers to the chilling narrative. His actions sparked changes in how law enforcement handled serial crimes, especially regarding the psychology behind such brutal behavior. While Richard Ramirez was incarcerated, his legacy continued to inspire a renewed focus on the minds of serial killers. Sociologists and criminologists examined his behavior to understand what made someone like him capable of such cruelty. But even after his death in 2013, the haunting specter of the Night Stalker remains. His story is a somber reminder of the darkness that can exist within a seemingly ordinary person, and the ongoing mystery of what drives such unrelenting violence. Albert Fish, the Gray Man. Albert Fish, born in 1870, was a figure whose name remains etched in the dark corners of American criminal history. Operating in the early 20th century, Fish's brutal actions unfolded during a time of societal transition, the dawn of the 1900s, when industrialization was changing the landscape, and crime was beginning to capture the public's imagination. Law enforcement was still developing its methods, and the psychological understanding of violent crime was in its infancy, making it even harder to stop a man whose twisted mind went unnoticed for years. Fish's early life was marked by signs of deep trauma. Born into an unstable family, he was abandoned by his parents at a young age, which led him into foster care. Growing up in an environment of neglect, Fish endured physical and emotional abuse, and his later behaviors hinted at the dark thoughts festering in his mind. His first brushes with crime were not violent, yet by the time he reached adulthood, the seeds of sadism had already taken root. Fish became known for his ability to blend into society, masking his depravity behind an ordinary exterior, allowing him to slip through the cracks undetected. His crimes began in the 1920s, but it was in 1928 that his true horrors came to light. Fish preyed on young children, luring them with promises of candy and then subjecting them to unspeakable acts before ending their lives. His killings were methodical, each crime carried out with a disturbing ritual. The pattern was chillingly consistent, leaving a trail of devastated families and a terrified public. The victims were innocent children, some barely old enough to speak. Their backgrounds, varied as they were, all shared one tragic commonality: they were vulnerable. As the bodies began to pile up, public fear escalated, and the media sensationalized the story, amplifying the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case. At first, there were no leads, but the investigators soon found themselves chasing shadows, as Fish had covered his tracks well. For years, his name remained a mystery, his crimes a haunting enigma. It wasn't until 1934, after a series of letters linked him to his final victim, that Fish was apprehended. His capture came after he inadvertently revealed his involvement in the crime, showing the degree of arrogance that accompanied his madness. His trial was a spectacle, drawing national attention. Fish's defense tried to present him as insane, a man whose deranged mind could not be held accountable for his actions. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public was both horrified and fascinated by the depths of his depravity. Fish was convicted of murder, and after a lengthy legal battle, he was sentenced to death. In 1936, he was executed by electric chair, his life of terror finally ending, though the shockwaves of his crimes continue to ripple through history. Albert Fish's legacy is a disturbing one. His crimes have led to significant changes in how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, particularly those involving children. His psychological profile prompted new discussions on the nature of human depravity, and his story continues to be a point of reference in studies of criminal behavior. Fish's name lives on not only in the dark recesses of true crime history but also in the collective consciousness of a society forever changed by the grisly details of his actions. Thank you for watching, and if this video was informative and educative, please share, like, subscribe, and wait for the part 2 of this video because we are not done, we are digging deeper.